him forward with a loud salawat. Hayyan is a barrister who worked as a parliamentary researcher since 2011. He was secretary of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Islamophobia, now secretary of the APPG on British Muslims, and an independent member of the cross-government anti-Muslim hatred working group. As such, he advises ministers, parliamentarians, the police, CPS, and various departments. He is also executive director of the Muslim Experience in WW1, an archival project of Forgotten Heroes, 14 to 19 Foundation, which aims to challenge anti-Muslim sentiment and extremism of all sorts by highlighting the unknown contributions of over 2 million Muslim soldiers and laborers who contributed to the history of Europe. Today, he will inshallah be speaking to us about the unknown stories of 2.5 million Muslim soldiers and laborers in World War I. Salawat.
Assalamu alaikum. Dear friends, thank you so much for having me here. I'm very, very honored and privileged to have the opportunity to sit with you, to share the knowledge that I have, and to introduce the project that I work on the contribution of Muslims in World War I. This project is a project by the Forgotten Heroes 1419 Foundation. The reason why the numbers 1419 appear in our title is because in modern history we learn that the First World War was fought between 1914 and 1918. However, our findings show that the contribution of the colonial soldiers of World War I, the battles that they continued to fight in, continued up until the end of 1919. And as this focus of this project is about the contribution of the colonial Muslim soldiers, we cover the final period, which includes that final year. And of course, this also raises the issue about how we remember in Europe Remembrance Sunday or Armistice Day as the end of the First World War, when in fact we would say that 100 years wouldn't be over until 2019. Before I begin, it's important to make the distinction that this project is not an endorsement of military or political strategies of the colonial powers at the time of World War I. Our project is simply about remembering and paying tribute to the soldiers from different backgrounds, faiths, and cultures, nations, languages, and identities who were the colonial soldiers of the powers at the time for the Allied forces, as well as those who are forgotten. And we remember these because we believe that they deserve their recognition because they fought in World War I with dignity, with honor, with respect. They remained steadfast Muslims. They were admired deeply by their European counterparts. And the stories of their powerful interfaith interactions can be a powerful antidote to the anti-Muslim sentiment, Islamophobia, the anti-refugee sentiment that we see in here today in Europe, the rise of the far right who want to drive out Muslims from Europe, who want to say that Muslims have no place in Europe. Well, what we have found is that, as the brother kindly mentioned in his introduction, that over 2.5 million Muslim soldiers fought and served with bravery and honor in World War I for the colonial soldiers, for the colonial powers, the Allied forces. And it would be a shame to forget about the hundreds of thousands of Egyptians, North African, American, Chinese, Russian, Muslim soldiers and laborers that took part in this. By way of a quick summary, I will share with you what we, over the last 6 years, have found. So we have gained access to 850,000 unique documents in Arabic, Hebrew, French, Urdu, confirming the contribution of these Muslim soldiers for Europe. These documents have been found across over 370 locations, as military and diplomatic archives, libraries, private collections in over 19 different countries. In terms of figures, I can share with you that 2 million Middle East and North African Muslim soldiers and laborers fought with the Allied forces, including 400,000 South Asian Muslim soldiers, 5,000 American soldiers who were Muslim, and also 375,000 Muslim soldiers from the Russian armies also fought. 25,000 of the Chinese Labor Corps were Muslim soldiers, and tens of thousands of African soldiers were enlisted in the British, French, and Portuguese armies. So very few people are aware of these facts from World War I. Many of the documents that we have found include photographs, field reports, personal diaries, and letters from those soldiers that didn't make it home to their families, to their wives, their fathers, their children. And these demonstrate and confirm the service and sacrifice that Muslim soldiers made for Europe in the First World War. Some of you may be wondering, but all of these soldiers must have been conscripted, and they didn't have a choice. In truth, actually, very few soldiers were conscripts. Many of these soldiers voluntarily signed up because, of course, it was they felt that it was something that they could do, but also it was a job and it paid. Very few were actually forced or forced to sign up just because they were subjects, if you like, of colonial powers. The growth of the far right, xenophobia, anti-Muslim hatred, anti-refugee sentiment is alarming. There are so many people who want to divide us today, and this is growing in Europe. They want to convince us that Islam and the West are incompatible, that they present a clash of civilizations, that we as different peoples of faiths and nations and cultures can't live together peacefully. But what we have found in the archives of World War I proves otherwise. We want to retell a forgotten but substantial part of the contribution of Muslim soldiers to the history of the world. I believe that by learning this at schools, that youths of all faiths and none will gain the confidence to challenge the far-right narratives and the extremist narratives that want to push these divisive clash of civilizations type narratives against our youth today. In turn, I believe also that European children will grow up finding a newfound respect for Muslims while they celebrate and learn of their heritage in Europe. We believe that we'll equip the next generation to be better informed, to be global citizens. And I don't believe that, and I believe the value of this is completely immeasurable. It is my opinion that the future is in knowing our history, and with your help and support, we hope to create the most comprehensive archive of the contribution of Muslim soldiers to World War I in our lifetime. And I think that it would become an undeniable record of the heritage of Muslims in Europe. We believe this is important because as people want to drive out Muslims from Europe and say that they don't belong in Europe, we will say, in actual fact, Muslims have given so much service and sacrifice to Europe 100 years ago, but also before that, but 100 years ago, and so therefore they are stakeholders in Europe. They have every right to be in Europe. Our communities, our ancestors have served for Europe. I will move to the second slide. I don't know if it's... So our ultimate mission is to create bridges of peace between an understanding between people of different nations, cultures, religions, and belief, to instill the values of tolerance, mutual respect, and humanity. Conflicts such as the First World War are often taught by listing just events and battles, statistics, instead of addressing how people personally experience those the conflicts. We want to unveil the personal stories of these soldiers to foster a new kind of dialogue, to find a common humanity based on these new universal values. Conflict, war, and terrorism have become dominant and prominent headlines in recent times. Yet people or historians have not explored how people have personally experienced these conflicts. We believe that understanding the human aspect of these conflicts not only gives one an understanding of the real consequences of war, but also helps us understand why why things are the way they are, and it gives us lessons to learn from them. Of course, wars are never positive things. War, death, destruction are horrible things. But what we have found in the archives of World War I are incredibly powerful, positive stories of how people from different faiths and backgrounds supported each other, looked out for each other. And this is what I hope to share with you today. So many of the over 2.5 million Muslim soldiers from the Middle East, North Africa, South Asia, the United States, China, and Russia fought with dignity and honor. Many of them were much more decorated than some of their European counterparts. Muslims have played a positive role in the history of Europe. And this is what I believe makes the legitimate case that they are stakeholders. We believe that sharing this will create a wealth of documented evidence that portrays Muslims positively, thus challenging Islamophobia and anti-Muslim and anti-refugee sentiment. I think the importance of educating our youth with this information as an antidote against those things can't be underestimated. So it's our belief that collating and preserving these things, whether it be in a physical archive or a digital archive, or if it's creating materials for schools, sending young children, both European, Muslim and non, to visit the sites of World War I battlefields, the sites of Muslim burial grounds, of which there are hundreds of thousands, that they can bring different people of different backgrounds together. And what we've also found is that in going through the letters that these young, brave Muslim soldiers wrote and sent home, some of them or in their journals, they did not commit any atrocities. They did not behead people. There were no such thing as suicide bombers. They didn't rape women. They didn't torture people. They didn't enslave women or children. They fought with honor and dignity, and it is important because this highlights the contradiction that what Daesh represent today. Daesh are in no way honorable soldiers. They are in fact an insult for our Islam and for Muslims. I want to share with you an image of this soldier. His name is Leon. He was a professional soldier from Flanders Fields. He was a Flemish. He was the inspiration behind this project. He's the grandfather of the chairman of this project. He was a great friend and colleague of mine. And he wrote in his diary, "I still cannot figure out why these Muslims from overseas are fighting so fiercely in a war that is not of their concern. They keep referring to their religion and family traditions of honor and loyalty. Many of them get wounded or die because they never leave somebody behind, regardless of culture, race, or religion. We talk a lot about them. We are happy to have them on our side." These were some of the images that we found of the aftermath of World War I in some of the trenches. You'll see that they are not pretty images to look at. So now try to imagine a Muslim soldier in these trenches in a foreign land, writing to his father in December 1916. He said, "We live in caves like hedgehogs, and we constantly have rain on our heads. We are exposed to deafening noises. People's faces changed and are altered under the effect of fear. We are in a state that language cannot describe. This country has been forsaken by Allah. Meat is brought to us in dishes, but we don't know whether it is permitted or prohibited. This is a source of torment for me. I think about it day and night, and you must tell me how I stand now in relation to Allah. Let me tell you, my dear father, and I swear by Allah that by that which we hold sacred, I will never stop saying my prayers. I will never abandon my faith, even if I am assailed by ordeals more terrible than those in which I find myself. I am not boasting when I speak like this. I am inspired by Allah. I ask Him to help me to remain true to Him and to save me." And it's in these conditions, in a foreign land, in a place that he didn't know, that he continued to fight with honor and dignity. Sadly, the soldier's letter never made it home to his father. One day, maybe I hope that we will send many of letters and journals like this to the surviving members of these soldiers' families today, who, until this project, will have no idea that their ancestors fought in the war. The different backgrounds of people created a brotherhood. We found that Muslim, Christian, Hindu, and Sikh soldiers fought united, side by side. They shared their experiences in accommodating each other's cultures, music, food, religious practices, cultures, despite the difficult conditions of the trenches. It did not bother them what their brother-in-arms race, faith, culture, language was. All they cared about was what you shared with them. They survived together. And we have also discovered that there are no records of racism or sectarianism or tribalism amongst the Muslim soldiers, who, many of whom from different sects or tribes or nations, would have met each other for the first time. This resulted in a wonderful mutual respect that is almost unimaginable today. You can say that this was interfaith in practice before the term interfaith ever existed. We've also found some very, very positive and comforting stories of priests, imams and rabbis comforting dying Muslim soldiers with verses from the Quran, as well as imams administering the last rites to Christian soldiers while they died on the battlefield. Of course, the religious men were limited in their ability to be everywhere where the battle was taking place. And there was such an extremely strong respect and demand from ordinary soldiers asking for instructions and learning from their Christian or Muslim or Jewish counterparts, their religious rites. So much so that at the time, the French Minister of War, Alexander Millerand, sent the following directive with instructions to soldiers and to regiments on the 8th of December 1914. He wrote, "When a Muslim is about to die, he will always, when he can, pronounce the Shahada, either setting his index finger of his right hand in the air or holding the Quran. If his state does not allow him to do so himself, anybody present is obliged to help him and pronounce for him this profession of Muslim faith. I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and I bear witness that Muhammad is his messenger of Allah." In practice, what often happened was that priests or rabbis or any other religious figures on the battlefield would often look for their Muslim colleagues first to recite or to assist their dying soldier, a Muslim soldier, to be able to recite the Shahada, where the dying soldier was not able to pronounce it himself. But of course, where they couldn't find a Muslim soldier, they did their best to honor that practice, and they tried their best, according to the instruction given by the Minister of War, to do it themselves. That seems like such an unimaginable story today. I'll show you some more images of soldiers. You'll see that there's a priest there comforting a Muslim soldier, and this is in a town called Amiens in France, I believe. The image on the top left, and you can see in the background that there are nurses and other European personnel who are witnessing Muslims praying collectively together for the first time. For this is the show for them. They had never seen such activity before. And as you'll see, that these Muslim soldiers were welcomed, they were admired, they were respected. They arrived in the hundreds of thousands for the aid of Europe. They were seen as celebrities. People were taking photographs with them. you'll see that there were European women taking pictures very proudly with their children alongside these Muslim soldiers. They thought of them as heroes. They came to save them. This image is particularly powerful for me, and it's probably one of my favorite images. This is, I believe it's from 1916. It shows 3 Muslim soldiers caring for a German prisoner of war. The Canadian, French, and British officers were stunned at the fact that these Muslim soldiers were caring, were feeding and giving water to a German prisoner of war, knowing that the Germans had committed some atrocities months before or weeks before and had used chemical weapons, mustard gas, on a regiment of Moroccan and Algerian troops. When these French and Canadian and British officers asked the Muslim soldiers why they were looking after the German prisoners of war, they responded to say that, well, it's part of our faith. We are told in the Quran and the Hadith that we must give subsistence to those who we capture. We can't treat our prisoners of war with cruelty. We can't torture them. We must ensure that they are well fed and looked after. This is also before the Geneva Convention. These are Muslims setting the example of how one should engage in battle and look after their captured, even before these kind of rules of engagement or the Geneva Convention was set. And these Muslim soldiers did so because they were steadfast in their faith. They were representatives of their faith. Here are more images that we have. So you'll see the image on the top right shows cavalries of soldiers on horseback from Morocco arriving in France and Belgium, I believe also. And you can see the streets are lined with Europeans, local Europeans, astonished and amazed that these soldiers are arriving for them. And they are being received already as war heroes before the war has, before their contribution in the war has begun. This was the first ever mosque to be built in Germany. But it's not a positive story. This mosque was built inside Zossen, which was a prisoner of war camp that was operated by the Germans and the Ottomans. There was a Turkish imam who was the imam, or the head of this mosque in this camp. And his sole purpose was to capture and was to convince the Muslim soldiers who fought for the Allied forces to change sides, to convince them to abandon their loyalty to their colonial powers, to their jobs, to the commitments that they'd made. In a way, you can say this was the first recorded brainwashing, or the first recorded jihad. Of course, illegitimate jihad, or one could say, of imams trying to convince Muslim soldiers to change their loyalty. But what is also positive about this is that over 95% of the Muslim soldiers did not change sides. They did not decide to fight for the other side. And this is important, I think, to learn, or at least to tell Europeans today, that if there's a question about loyalty, do Muslims belong in our country? Do Muslims support our nation, the instruments of our countries? Are they loyal? Examples like this shows that Muslims don't have a problem with loyalty, especially as they make a commitment as Muslims to do something, whether it's a job or whatever. They remain loyalty because it's a principle that they hold dear as Muslims. There was a movie, or propaganda film, created by the Germans at the time to try and counteract this stubbornness by the Muslim soldiers at the time who were captured not to change sides. It was called Danger in Dahomey. It was a film that was made to be shown to the German population And it was manipulated to include images that showed some of the dead German soldiers who were serving in that prison camp. It had hidden their faces, and it had showed pictures of the Muslim soldiers who were standing around them. And it had tried to demonstrate that the German soldiers here were being killed and slaughtered by their Muslim prisoners in this prison camp. It was completely untrue. Also, the propaganda movie tried to present the idea that these Muslim soldiers have taken over this prison camp so much that they have built a mosque inside it. We think fake news is a new thing. In fact, these things are old and they continued. Then, it's nothing new. But this happened because those Muslim soldiers did not want to collaborate in any way with a force that they did not agree with. This film is such a rare document. It's so hard to find. We believe that there is only 1 or 2 copies of it left. And of course, you can imagine the conditions that it would have been stored in would be in a very bad state. This is one of many examples of the kinds of documents that we need to preserve and save in order so we can retell this story. The reason why this is important, because today, this prisoner of war camp no longer stands. The picture on the top right shows I believe it's a supermarket parking lot. The street says Moskstrasse, which means Mosque Street, but there is no street there anymore. It has been demolished. There are no records of this mosque or this prison camp having been there, except for some documents that we found that reference it and this movie, this German propaganda film. Without preserving these archives, there would be nothing left to tell these stories. And this is part of the challenge. There are sites that have been desecrated by far-right extremists, by people who don't want to accept that many Muslims or people of other faith and minority backgrounds served for their countries in World War I. Far-right extremists want to deny this information because it doesn't help their cause. They want to say that Muslims don't belong here. They want to say that Muslims have never done anything good for us. There are other sites where far-right extremists have taken hammers and have destroyed sites, destroyed graves, destroyed some wonderful places. And there are many more that we know of that have yet yet remain undemolished. And of course, we're keeping those secret until we can do something about protecting them. But I also think that part of this ignorance and stupidity can only be overcome by education. We can't allow people of the far right to take over this narrative of this. We have to teach the information that we learn in schools. We have to teach young people, whether they're Muslim or not, about this information, so that when young people hear, or let's say young non-Muslim European children hear from, say, somebody who might sympathize with a far-right active extremist, and they say Muslims have never done anything, they can turn around and legitimately challenge those voices and say, well, that's not true. I learnt in school that 2.5 million Muslim soldiers died for us too. And that's just one example of how this can be overcome. So this is part of our rescue mission. We want to save these archives, because if there is no proof that of these archives ever having existed, if they are not preserved, we will erase the heritage and the history of these soldiers. And again, our project is not about endorsing military strategy. It's not about endorsing colonial powers. It's not about endorsing their political strategies. It's not about even making a judgment about whether those strategies were good or bad, or whether they failed, or whether they served the interests of the colonial, of the nations of which they were in control of. It is simply to set the record straight, to say that these Muslims and many others served in World War I. They need to be remembered. They need to be given the appropriate tribute, because regardless of the military and political decisions of the time, they were still there. They still died. They left their homes, their wives, their children, their families, to a foreign land they had never been to, in order to stand by a commitment that they had made. We have to save every document before it's lost, before it's destroyed. Because if we don't, it means that a Muslim soldier, or all of the Muslim soldiers, would have died in vain. Their death and their sacrifice, their service would have been meaningless. We will never learn about their messages of faith and steadfastness, and how their interactions with other Muslims, as well as Christians, Sikhs and Hindus and Jews, were positive. There are so many records related to the Muslim contribution in World War I, stored in archives, also in World War II, that have already been lost. And I will give you a few examples. And I hope that this will demonstrate the importance of why it's so important to save this information. So these are a list of documents and caches of documents that we have lost, if you like. So in 1940, during the Second World War, during the German invasion of Louvain, the building of the Catholic University in Belgium was burnt down. In that library, there were 900,000 manuscripts and books related to World War I. In World War II, the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, destroyed a library building in Belgium, in the Library of Belgrado, along with a book collection of 500,000 volumes, 4,000 journals, and 1,800 newspaper titles, front pages, showing some of the rich and irreplaceable documents about both the Ottoman armies, as well as the correspondence of distinguished figures from cultural and political offices during the First World War. One of these newspapers from Belgium we have actually saved. On the front cover, it gives a very clear message from the Ministry of Defense at the time. It's because at the time, European soldiers were handed out rations of alcohol for their morale, and this was very normal amongst Europeans. But of course, they had to be sensitive to the cultural needs and the religious observances of Muslim soldiers. So the Ministry of Defense, on the front page of a Belgian newspaper, sent out an order, if you like, and they asked that when they are consuming the alcohol that they have been given, that they respect the fact that their Muslim soldiers, comrades, don't drink alcohol, and that they would feel uncomfortable. So the Ministry of Defense then asked their soldiers to either do so in private, or at least not in the faces of the soldiers. They asked them to respect that. We can't imagine something like that today. I'd imagine newspapers today would say something like, Muslims want to take away our booze, right? So there was so much respect from Europeans to Muslims that I think that this is also a lesson that Europeans can learn today. They can also take lessons from how their European ancestors treated people of different backgrounds. Another example of lost documents is the Oriental Institute in Sarajevo in 1992. During the siege of Sarajevo, it was destroyed. They had a manuscript collection, which was one of the richest collections of Oriental manuscripts in the world. Losses included thousands of documents relating to the battles of Mesopotamia against the Indian forces. In 1992, members of the army of the Republic of Srebrenica in Bosnia, the archival library holding documents showing, referring to Allied Muslim soldiers fighting in the Balkans, were destroyed. In April 2003, in Baghdad, most libraries and archives have been burnt and looted. Over 30,000 documents containing correspondence to Iraqis fighting with the British were lost. The Egyptian Scientific Institute has been the oldest scientific institute in Egypt. It holds the richest and rarest library in Egypt, with more than 200,000 volumes of documents. In December 2011, it was set on fire. 170,000 volumes referring to the Egyptian contribution in World War I were lost as a result of that fire. On the 7th of February in 2014, the National Archives of Bosnia-Herzegovina burned to the ground by extreme right Serbs, erasing 250,000 documents covering the Muslim contribution in both World War I and World War II. And finally, on the 20th of December in Iraq 2014, the Library of Mosul University, the National Library of Anbar, and other private libraries were destroyed by Daesh. All of these contained documents and archives from World War I that proved the contribution of Muslims in both World War I and World War II. And so this is why it's important for us to preserve this information, and this is why we need the help of everybody. This is why we need your help. We want to maintain our independence and integrity as an organization. We want to maintain the integrity of our narrative so that it is not influenced by others or organizations or countries or nations who may want to tell us that we cannot tell certain parts of history or reveal certain documents. Because of course, as you know, there won't be everything, not everything will be positive about World War I. It is our mission to show everything. And so that's why we are funded privately by public and private donations. We are not funded by any nation. We're not funded by any military. And so every penny that communities could give to organizations like us gives us the opportunity to preserve, to buy, to scan, to digitize, and to create a digital archive, as well as a physical archive of all of these documents, all in one place. And of course, time is not on our side for many reasons. As I mentioned earlier, the rising far right, the rising anti-Muslim rhetoric is growing across Europe, in the US, and across the world. But also, right now, Europe and the US remembers the centenary. It is going to be 100 years next year of World War I. Now is the time to remember these events, these people, these soldiers. So please do speak about this project to your friends, your colleagues, your family. But also consider this. By investing in history, we'll be learning and investing about our future. But you'll also be investing about the future of your children, your grandchildren, and their friends, their colleagues, their peers. Because they will grow up to be better informed about the history of the world. They will grow up to be better informed about the positive interfaith, intercultural relations that existed between people 100 years ago that don't seem imaginable today. And this, I think, is a very positive narrative and a positive project that I don't think that anybody would deny. So please do visit our website. Share your thoughts, share this project on Twitter, we're on Facebook, we're on all the social media platforms. And also, please don't hesitate to approach me or my colleagues if there's anything that a local school, a madrasa, or a mosque, or a community center that you may be involved with can get involved. We're also running we have recently launched World War I tours to some of the battlefields in France. It's a 2-day tour. Of course, we cater for halal food. And we're the only organization currently who is doing this tour aimed at a Muslim audience, but also that will visit sites where the Muslim burial sites and the battlegrounds and other prominent, important places are. And in closing, I would say, we've also got to remember that these soldiers came to the aid of Europe at a time when Europe needed their help, or at least the Allied forces. Unfortunately, 100 years later, it's the Middle East that needs the help of Europe. It's also important that we tell Europeans about this story, because they need to remember maybe it's now time to remember the contribution and the sacrifice and the service of Middle East and North Africans, South Asians, the Chinese and others who have helped Europe, and it's about time maybe for Europe to remember them and to help them. Unless anybody has any questions, I'm more than happy to take questions or anything else. But thank you so much for listening to me, and thank you so much for giving me the time and the opportunity to tell you about this important project. And I apologize if I sound like I'm mumbling, but I've just recovered from a cold. So, and I assure you, the man cold is the worst form of cold. So I want all of your sympathy. But thank you very much.
Allah. Thank you very much. We have some time for question and answers. Do you have any questions?
Assalamu alaikum, brother. Thank you so much. This has been revealing, to say the least. I'd just like to dwell on the negative side, just so that I can get it out of the way.
Absolutely.
It's because I remember from history, because we didn't study much of this. So the only history we know about World War I is in England now, which is being bandied about, is the trenches, right? So that happened in Europe, in like France and half Germany. So am I right in saying there were a lot of other battlefronts as well? I mean, there must have been in the Iraq, in the Mesopotamia region, and coming up to maybe Germany, Turkey. So were the Muslims of Turkey on the wrong side in this, if I remember right?
That's a good question. And I'm probably not going to give you the answer that you want. Of course, I should qualify, I'm not a historian. So I can't claim that anything that I talk about outside of our projects and that narrative is going to be accurate. And I wouldn't want to say something that would be inaccurate. But I do know that battles and skirmishes involving the colonial soldiers, including the Muslims, took place not just in Belgium and France, but also in Mesopotamia, in Russia, in Eastern Europe, and other locations. Off the top of my head, I can't give you the information, but I will. I can find out more information from you. I'll give you my contact details.
Sorry. So in the beginning, in when you did the summary right at the beginning, that was amazing because it sort of rings a bell, because one of my nieces did a project in nearby college in sixth form, and maybe 4 years later, I still saw that on the board, and it said 1914 to 1918, but that was obviously about the British side of things. There was no mention of any Muslims being enrolled at the time. So I must say now I feel so much better now that she did whatever she did, and a part of that was also there were Muslim lives at stake there as well. In the last thing, it's just that your aim is noble, and I can see that there is room for what do you call this, funding, crowdfunding kind of a project, if you make. But have you actually made a documentary in terms of maybe a 20-minute, 30-minute documentary, which we can go on YouTube and have a look at?
We haven't made a documentary. We're producing some promotional material, such as a video and some other material, which I can't reveal yet. But there is some literature that will be produced very soon, including video materials that we will produce. So all I would say is watch this space. But in terms of what you said earlier about what we learnt as children, or at any time about World War I in Europe or in the US, for example, even as a youngster growing up learning history in class, I always used to think, why on earth do we call this World War I? This is European war. But that's just because of the limited resources that we are given or taught in school. And I think that, I just think it's such a shame that this information is not taught, that it could actually, that it should be. And part of what we want to do one day is produce literature and materials for schools, not just in Europe, but also in the Middle East and North Africa, so that it can include this information. But of course, there is such a wealth of documents on World War I suppose I can understand the difficulties in covering all of those topics, while also trying to gear it towards an audience that is a European audience. But we certainly are making the case that this information and the curriculums need to change. Yes.
Khadija.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
Thank you very much, and for your work on this project. I'd like to start by caveating my question and saying it's not intended to be critical or provocative. But do you think it's possible that projects like this actually feed into the far-right narrative? So the reason I say that is because part of the far-right narrative is Muslims don't belong in places like the UK and other European countries. And by showing that, you know, Muslims in the past have sacrificed their life, the kind of made the ultimate sacrifice for Europe, we're kind of feeding into a narrative that says you don't belong, and so you've got to go to the kind of extreme to prove that you do belong, and that's actually not really a sense of belonging, because no one else has to show that. Yeah, my grandfather fought in World War I and sacrificed his life, or my great grandfather. And so we are actually almost feeding into a narrative that makes us feel like we have to show that we've kind of sacrificed our blood for this country, which I don't think is true for other people. So if you could just comment.
Sure. No, it's often a question that people put to us, but unfortunately, it's also a question that most people don't ask us, and they assume automatically that that our project is somehow an endorsement of military recruitment of Muslims, or that it's an endorsement of the view that you can only prove your loyalty if you fight as a soldier. It's neither of those things. Of course, we have to do a better job of reassuring people that that's not what our project is about. Our project is simply about showing that this is a historical record that needs to be taught and needs to be shown. And of course, encountering far-right narrative with this information is just a byproduct of what we can do with this information. And our project is just to say that they served, it happened, they were there, and they still deserve their recognition and their tributes, regardless of whether people accept or share the view that the decisions to go to war, or for those colonial regiments and troops to join their colonial powers in going to war, was something that was acceptable or otherwise. But we certainly don't believe or push the view that one can only prove their loyalty to their country by being soldiers. This is simply saying, no, that Muslims have done it before, and it is being ignored by certain elements, but it deserves to be taught nonetheless.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for your wonderful project.
Thank you.
Can I just correct, you may correct me, in the beginning you mentioned about how the Muslim soldiers joined the colonial forces.
Mm-hmm.
It was because when the British, the European forces were losing the war with Germany, that suddenly in the last 2 years, they started recruiting haphazardly all over the world for people to join them. And most of them were from South Asian continent. So that's the correction, I think, should be there. Secondly, this project of yours is very, very good, interesting. Are you going to set up a museum for the archives or anything in the mind of yours? And number three,
yes,
the final one, have you ever coordinated with the education department of the National Education Department?
The DFE here in the UK.
Yeah, to put forward this in the curriculums for historical, people, the children to understand and know the knowledge, the truth. So are these three, can you answer me all the three?
Yeah, sure. So I'll go in the order in which I remember them. In terms of, you're right, the recruitment of colonial soldiers and troops did take place towards when things weren't looking good. There wasn't a systematic, as I understand it, there wasn't a systematic process in place to recruit soldiers. It was just very haphazardly done. But it's not correct that a majority of them were from South Asia. That may be true in the British Army recruitment, because of course the British Indian Empire and the British Indian Army took their colonial troops from India. But of course the Allied forces, which included the French, some other European nations as well, of course they had colonial powers. They had colonies that they, were in control of or occupied, which included Algeria, Morocco, some South and Central African countries. In terms of trying to influence the curriculum in the DFE in this country, I think actually that would just be a very difficult thing to do, and there would be a very different way around it. It would be extremely difficult to change or to lobby to change the national curriculum in this country because the government no longer requires schools or academies. Every school will eventually become an academy to follow the national curriculum strictly. They are instructed now to follow the curriculum broadly. So I don't think that the government or the DFE would want to spend time and money and resources in changing the national curriculum if they're not asking educational institutions to follow it. So I think actually there may be other ways around that we can do this, whether it be producing literature for private organisations, for academies, trusts, and sharing it, or doing lectures and series, documentaries, producing online materials that they can be disseminated, that the schools can freely have the choice to learn or to teach their children or not. Well, I believe that was all the questions. Yeah, good. Oh, yes, sorry. It is our ultimate goal in an ideal world, if we could raise all the money in a very quick amount of time, that we would like to have a physical archive in one building, in one place, so everything is together. Sort of a collection of all of these documents from these 380 odd locations from 19 different countries. Ideally, we would like to bring them all into one place. And we have been purchasing and collating some of this stuff, and eventually we will collate it in a public, both physical and digital archive one day, inshallah.
Thank you very much for your very eye-opening and touching talk. So my question is, I was thinking if, say, a British soldier, someone joins up the British Army and they're taken on a tour of the battlefields, Flanders, and somewhere like Ypres, and they look at one of the graveyards, cemeteries, will they notice Muslim graves, or will they just be buried among all the other graves?
So the Muslim graves, so you'll know that graves of, say, Christian soldiers will be marked with a cross. They'll be engraved with a cross on the tombstone. On the Muslim soldiers' tombstones, it says in Arabic, "Here lies the deceased."
But so just to clarify, so in terms of scale, so there'll be so many Christian graves, presumably, will they just not notice the Muslim graves, or
no,
are
the
they quite
gravestones,
noticeable?
They are noticeable because
So
the gravestones also
quite a lot
are
of them
shaped
then.
differently too.
So
So some are shaped like an arch, or they've got a
Yeah.
curved
But
top.
I mean, there are quite a lot, so they'll notice them.
Yeah, there's so many.
Okay.
You can't not notice.
So it's not just like 1 in 1,000 or something, or
No.
1 in 10,000. Yeah,
That's right. And,
there's a lot.
There's a famous remembrance site of it's called the Ring of Remembrance, and it has engraved on brass all of the names of the soldiers whose bodies could not be found, and so they don't have a grave site. They don't have a burial place. Just go to one section where the surnames begin with M, and you'll see these 9-foot tall brass sheets, if you like, engraved with Muhammad. Hundreds and thousands of them. Or you'll see Khans and you'll see Arabic names. And it's undeniable. You can't ignore the fact that it's there. It's just about telling people where these are.
But say like a soldier training and they go, will they notice it? Will it be obvious to them, or would they have to look for it?
I believe it will be obvious.
Okay.
They just have to know where to look.
Okay, so that's what I said. So perhaps a lot of the Muslims will be in a separate section of the graveyard and they don't even visit that bit.
No, that's true. Sorry, that's not true.
Okay.
What we also found in there is a small cemetery which used to be a field hospital. The dead soldiers, as they were dying on their deathbeds, and they were beside their Jewish, their Christian, and other counterparts, there was a lot of sensitivity at the time from the top, from the ministries of defense at the time, who wanted to bury the Muslim soldiers, the Jewish soldiers, Christian soldiers, and others separately because they thought that they'd be respecting their wishes. When those soldiers found out that that is what was being planned for them, they protested, whether in writing or to the people who were caring for them. They said, no, I want to be buried next to the man I fought with. And so in this particular cemetery, the name I can't remember at the moment, there are Christian, there are many rows where there is a Jewish grave right next to a Muslim grave, right next to a Jewish Christian grave, and vice versa. It's not uncommon to see that they are actually buried beside each other.
Thank you. And just one quick question, if I may. So, people not being aware of this history and that being people of other faiths fighting for the Allied forces, was there maybe some cover-up, not letting, because news would have been quite controlled? Was it not getting back home? Was it just something that the troops knew about between themselves, or were just known in those areas, but the news wasn't really getting back home?
No, it's a very valid point. It's another one of the questions that we get asked by a lot of people. I think actually what has happened is just a common sense explanation for why this is unknown. So it would have been a normal protocol or procedure at the time that when the First World War was over, or when the colonial powers removed themselves from the conflict, they would have taken with them the documents that would have been of the regiments that they controlled, so including the documents that would have been in Arabic, Hebrew, Urdu, and other languages. But of course, the new custodians or librarians of these documents in England or in France or Belgium or Switzerland, wherever, they wouldn't have known those languages. So one, they wouldn't have translated them. And second of all, it wouldn't have been the priority of the time of those nations to spend the time and money and resources in translating them and indexing them. I believe at the time they would have just focused on recovering their nation's economies, dealing with the aftermath of a very brutal war. So I don't believe there's any sinister reason. I just think that they were just put away and then slowly forgotten about. And it was actually, in many instances, it was our researchers around the world that were the first to ask these archives if they had any documents in Farsi, Arabic, Hebrew, Urdu, etc.
Sorry, I know
That's
I've gone
right.
on a bit, but for example, if a journalist wrote back from and reported his scenes from the battlefield in the Times, say, so he would have been writing about Muslims, Christians, Jews, and
Yeah.
okay.
And these documents do exist, so they do exist in newspaper prints, and some of them we have, and there are more that we know where they are, and we would like to find them and keep them.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We got a question from Zaid.
Thank you very much. I'm a bit worried that World War I doesn't really paint the Muslims in a very good light, seeing as the main aggressor, or the British were fighting the Ottoman Empire, which was presumably almost 100% Muslim. So I'm a bit worried that this project might backfire on us.
Again, I've always got to defer to our view that we're not making an endorsement of military or political strategies or decisions at the time. It is simply a project to set the record straight, that this is what happened, regardless of which side these soldiers were on and whether they were good or bad. It's not for us as our organisation to make that judgment or to set that tone or narrative. That's for historians or for people to learn about and come to the conclusions themselves. But at least for that debate and discussion to happen, you need to be well informed and have all the information at hand. And that's our goal, is to present everything as it was. Of course, there are sensitivities with the Ottomans and the other things that happened under the Ottoman Empire. And of course, there are some very difficult truths that we will have to deal with. But our goal and our project is simply about presenting the information as it is without that, without tainting it or putting that narrative over it. Rather, it would be for historians or students to talk and debate and discuss these options.
Thank you very much. We'll take the last question from Iqbal.
You said 2.5 million Muslims participated in
Yes.
World War I. How many were actually killed?
That figure, I don't know the exact figure, but it's the vast majority of them.
Okay.
And there is a piece of film that demonstrates how powerful this was, that we would like to get our hands on. It is a film that shows tens of thousands of Muslim soldiers across the fields of the Somme. And this was on Friday. Their praying their Friday prayers. They're praying Jummah. This is the day before the Battle of the Somme started. The following day, they're all dead. And that demonstrates, that I think is a very good visual demonstration, even though it's a small part of the whole picture, of how so many thousands of soldiers, Muslims who were there, and then of course they were decimated because of this very small concentrated battle zone.
So the other question is that, as you say, I mean, we're not here to judge the Ottoman position or whatever. Have you found in the correspondence of Muslim soldiers or participants any discussion about this Khilafat movement and the contradiction which many of them must have seen?
Yeah, without revealing too much at this stage, we have found some information that shows that there were American citizens who were of Turkish descent who actually signed up for very particular reasons with the US forces, because they were upset at the way in which the the Ottoman Empire had partnered up with the Germans, and for other reasons. And this we will, once we've examined it a bit more thoroughly, we'll be able to reveal and talk about and explore. So there were some. I'm not saying that that was the majority of you.
No indication of this kind of thinking from the Indian side.
I haven't yet seen or found anything personally, but
Okay.
I'm sure that we will in all the correspondence that we will find, that we have access to.
But excellent work.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we'll end there. Salawat.